Welcome to the Alaska Common Ground Forum on the Bristol Bay Forever Initiative, ballot measure number 4 at this year's general election on Tuesday, November 4th. I am Cliff Groh, chair of Alaska Common Ground. Alaska Common Ground is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging Alaskans in respectful conversations about major public policy issues facing our state. I thank our co-sponsors tonight, Anchorage Public Library, League of Women Voters of Alaska, League of Women Voters of Anchorage, and Alaska Integrated Media and its stations Hot Talk KOAN and Talk of the Valley KVNT. This event tonight is the last of 4 forums Alaska Common Ground has been holding this summer on the ballot propositions voters will see at the polls this year. We have held forums on the referendum on oil taxes, the minimum wage initiative, and the marijuana initiative. Video recordings of all of those forums are available on Alaska Common Ground's website at www.akcommonground.org. And video of tonight's forum will also be available on www.akcommonground.org tomorrow, courtesy of Alaska Commons. Thank you, Alaska Commons. And folks, we're not stopping there. We're holding another forum right here in this room all day Saturday, October 4th, on Alaska's fiscal and economic future. And I look forward to seeing you here at that event on October 4th. Folks, if you like what you see here and you like what you hear here, we need your help to pay for it. There's some people out there in the lobby who probably you saw on the way in, who you could donate to Alaska Common Ground or become members of this fine organization. You can become a member of this organization for a mere $35 a year for a regular membership. And we have a variety of memberships tailored to needs of various people. You can learn all about our organization, about our future forums coming up, and about how to join our organization online at www.akcommonground.org, as well as out in the lobby. Turning to tonight's forum on the Bristol Bay Forever Initiative, I ask you to be respectful to all the speakers' views. Please do not cheer or jeer or clap or boo. Please instead listen politely and save your applause for the end. And if you need to yell out your opinions, folks, please do it outside in the lobby or outside. We have knowledgeable speakers tonight. Advocating a yes vote will be Christina Salmon, a sponsor of the initiative and a resident of Igigek, and Anders Gustafson, Executive Director of Renewable Resources Coalition. Advocating a no vote will be Deantha Crockett, Executive Director of Alaska Miners Association, and Richard Hughes, Mining Engineer and Consultant. Later this evening, the moderator of this debate will be reading the debaters' questions from the audience that have been written down on cards. If you would like to submit a question, get a card from one of our volunteers, put a question on it, and give it to a volunteer. We have Barbara Carl in the back waving the cards. So get a card for her if you'd like to put your own question in. And folks, tonight, I think you have a pretty good chance of getting your question answered. The moderator tonight will be Dick Mylius, a board member of Alaska Common Ground who retired after a 29-year career at the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. Dick, take it away.
Thank you, Cliff. And thank you to the panelists for coming in tonight. I know, and thank you for the audience. I know it's been a busy week on Bristol Bay related issues with the EPA holding hearings, and I know tonight we're competing with a debate of the Republican senatorial candidates. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of what the initiative is and then turn it over to the panelists. This is the actual language in the initiative, and I'm going to go through this in a little more detail in a minute. Get the pointer here straightened out. And we've already gone through introductions here. The format for tonight's forum is that I'm going to give an overview. Then each of the panelists will give a 7-minute statements. We'll alternate between the proponents and the opponents on that. Then we'll have a 40-minute period of asking questions between the panelists, where we'll start out with the one side asking the other. I got to check my notes as to who goes first on that, when we get to that anyhow. And then we'll take questions from the audience, and we have closing statements, 2 minutes from each panelist, and then we adjourn promptly at 9 o'clock. This is the language that's in the ballot measure. This is the language that's actually on the ballot. And I know there's been some confusion and some questions about, we've labeled this form as a form on the Bristol Bay Forever Initiative. That's the actual title of the initiative that was submitted by the proponents. That was submitted to the Lieutenant Governor, but the actual title that's going to be on the ballot is what you see at the top of the page here, which is an act providing for protection of Bristol Bay wild salmon in waters within or flowing into the existing Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. And again, this is all the language that's actually going to be on the ballot. Kind of the key part of it is that language that's in red, which is that the bill will require the legislature to approve a future large-scale metallic sulfide mine in the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. And I'll explain a little bit about what the metallic sulfide mine is and talk about what the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve is. And the legislature must make the determination that the mine will not endanger the Bristol Bay fishery. The ballot initiative language also goes on to define a large-scale metallic sulfide mining operation. As you can see, there is a mining proposal to extract metals, including gold and copper, from sulfide-bearing rock that would disturb more than 640 acres. It allows the Department of Natural Resources to adopt regulations. The bill includes lengthy findings that basically, this is a summary of what those findings are, that it says that the legislature found the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve important when it created it in 1972. I'll talk a little bit more about what the actual language says in the 72 Fisheries Reserve. The protections are necessary, and that protecting the waters and wild salmon of the reserve are of a statewide interest. You can pretty much read what it says there. But again, this is language that's on the ballot. And then, again, kind of in summary, it says that the bill intends the legislature to approve any large-scale metallic sulfide mine in the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve that could adversely affect its watershed, and that it would only apply to mines in Bristol Bay that haven't received all their permits. A couple notes regarding that particular language. The first one is that it's a little ambiguous as to what it means when it says, this part here where it says that it could, the bill intends to approve any large-scale mine that could adversely affect the watershed. So, for example, if there was a road going to a mine that was outside the fisheries reserve, it's possible that that provision would click in. And then the other thing is that it's this last part of it here where it says any mine that has received its permits is not affected by this, but that's kind of irrelevant because no large-scale metallic sulfide mines in the fisheries reserve exists at this time, so that provision really wouldn't apply to anything. Again, so the bottom line is that what this initiative is it's that a yes vote will establish a state law requiring legislative approval of a large-scale mine greater than 640 acres in the fisheries reserve, and the legislature must make the specific finding. This is the exact language that's in the actual law that would be passed. A large-scale metallic sulfide mining operation will not constitute danger to the fishery within the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. So that's the standard the legislature is supposed to use. A no vote will keep the status quo, which means the existing federal, state, and any municipal permitting process would address any future large-scale mines in the region, but the legislature would not be required to give final approval. What is a metallic sulfide mine? It's a mine basically where the minerals occur in sulfuric rock and are susceptible to what's called acid rock drainage from tailings and pits. This acid rock drainage is carefully regulated, but there's concern about how it may impact fisheries and water quality, particularly long-term. The Pebble deposit is in sulfide rock, but not all gold and copper mines are. For example, Fort Knox is not a metallic sulfide mine, even though it is a gold mine. Is this about Pebble? Not specifically. The initiative never mentions Pebble, and a yes vote does not disapprove Pebble, or a yes or no vote. Either way, the initiative doesn't approve Pebble. It's not a yes or no vote on Pebble. However, Pebble is within the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve and would be greater than 640 acres and is a large-scale metallic sulfide mine. So if this passed, that would require that the legislature approve a future Pebble mine at the end of the permitting process. However, Pebble has not submitted any applications to develop a mine at this point. And there are also other known mineral deposits within the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve that could also be subject to the state law. So it's not a yes or no vote on Pebble, and it's not only about Pebble because it affects, as we'll see, a fairly large geographic area. I put this in just because this week we're competing with public hearings that EPA is holding on its Section 404C study and proposed restrictions. This has nothing to do with that. This is, if this initiative passes, it would add a state law requiring state legislative approval, has no impact on or is not related to EPA's proposal. The only thing is that EPA is kind of competing with us this week on public meetings. The Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve was established by the legislature in 1972. The existing state law is pretty narrow in focus and geographic area, and it specifically says, what you can see there in quotations, a surface entry permit to develop an oil and gas lease or an exploration license may not be issued on state-owned or controlled land within controlled land until the legislature finds the entry will not constitute a danger to the fisheries. So that language is actually very similar to what's in the initiative in terms of the standard the legislature uses. What's different is that it only applies to surface entry to develop an oil and gas lease, and then it also defines the geographic area to only be the state's submerged lands and shorelands that are within the fisheries reserve, which basically is the land under the water. So the current fisheries reserve only applies to the waters out there. It does not require legislative approval for the state to issue an oil and gas lease, and it does not require state legislative approval for oil and gas upland development. The state has held oil and gas lease sales in the reserve, but there's been no commercial discoveries. Therefore, nobody has ever had a need for surface entry within the fisheries reserve, and the legislature has never been asked to implement this particular law. The fisheries reserve, I've got two maps that kind of show it. This is one that is a good outline of what the fisheries reserve is geographically. It's a large area. It's defined initially by latitude and longitude. This longitude and this latitude, and basically all the waters that drain into it. Anchorage would be right up about there. Lake Iliamna here. This is Wood-Tickchick Park over here at Dillingham. It goes down as far south as Ugashik, and then includes the whole Quejack, Iliamna Lake, Mulchatna, Nushagak River drainages. The initiative basically does three significant things to the existing fisheries reserve. It adds those large-scale metallic mines to the things requiring legislative approval. It broadens the geographic area to include the entire drainage, including uplands. And it also applies not just to state waters or state lands, it applies to state, private, and federal lands within the reserve. This is kind of this map didn't come out too well, but it is in here to illustrate kind of the land ownership within the fisheries reserve. This is the boundary of the fisheries reserve. The blue is state lands. There's about 10 million acres of state-owned land within the fisheries reserve. There's several million acres of native corporation lands, which are the pink lands, and the federal lands. Federal lands are largely in the parks. This is Lake Clark National Park, and this is Katmai, and then this part of the Basharoff and Alaska Peninsula Wildlife Refuges. So the federal lands are largely off limits to mining already. There's been some recent court action regarding the initiative. The Lieutenant Governor approved it in 2012. It was challenged as being inappropriate for being on a topic for an initiative. It's challenged as being local and special legislation and an appropriation. The state Superior Court and then the Supreme Court ruled that the initiative is not barred by the Constitution and can be on the ballot. The reason why I'm putting this up here is that this action was just, as you can see, it was just June 23rd, just a little over a month ago that this was basically given a green light to go ahead to be on the ballot. There is still questions about separation of powers that may be come up. The vote on this will be, it was originally scheduled for the August primary, but with the legislators' late adjournment, it was moved to November. It'll be ballot measure number 4, and there, as you can see, is the title for it. And with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists to give their talks here, and each side has 7 minutes, And I believe we're starting with Anders. You starting off then?
Sure.
So we'll start with Anders, then Deantha, then Christina, and then Rich.
Thanks. Let me see if this mic is right. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks. Again, my name is Anders Gustafson. I'm the Executive Director of the Renewable Resources Coalition and Foundation based here in Anchorage. We're a statewide organization. We've grown over the years to be a large organization with well over 8,000 members across the state and actually through the country as the issue around Bristol Bay and the development of Pebble Mine has progressed over the last 6 to 7 years. My background coming into this was as a fishing guide in the region. I came to Alaska at the ripe age of 18 and found myself on the shores of the Mulchatna River, slaying king salmon every summer as a college job, a job that I still hold to this day and can't let go of. Once you get the bug, I guess you've got it. Anyways, I was in this area and watched the Pebble project start to get developed and promoted in the early 2000s. And at some point around 2006, I felt compelled to take action and work to protect the fishery that I'd grown to love. That came in the opportunity of working with the coalition and the foundation on educating Alaskans about what we considered to be the risks of Pebble Mine and what the threat was to the fishery. And we found that through that process, we needed to educate Alaskans just at how fantastic this fishery was. Alaska's a big state, and not everybody goes everywhere in this state. I found that there was a lot of misinformation about the health and the run and the communities and the region and just what made the entire region so special. This is a picture of Frying Pan Lake, a photo I took several years ago just below the Pebble Mine site. And obviously this was the impetus for a lot of us to get involved in this issue. And I really was excited about working on this issue because this is the first time I had seen in the history of Alaska that groups from commercial fishing, sport fishing, and subsistence fishing had all agreed on something. And that agreement was that without the habitat and without the salmon, our livelihoods are all gone. And we became very passionate and became activists across the state. And the reason we was because we had seen what things had been done in the past in the mining industry elsewhere. And we were concerned about that coming into this region that didn't have any mineral developments. And we were trying to find out things that we could do to add protections to safeguard our livelihoods. And over the years, there's been many things proposed and tried and going on with this Pebble debate. This is just one of the latest, and this is actually, in my mind, a much broader argument. We're working on protecting the entire watershed. Pebble was just a piece of it. And we've noticed that there's a weakness in our system, and we need to protect that watershed as a whole, and that's why we support Ballot Measure 4 in one part. He's already talked about the history of the Fisheries Reserve. I just wanted to have this in here to highlight the fact that this is something that was created in 1972 when the oil and gas industry was developing in the state, and the legislature at this time, including Jay Hammond, was concerned with protecting this fishery. At that point, they didn't have a twinkle in their eye of what Pebble was or the threat of a large-scale metallic sulfide mine would be. So in our mind, amending this existing legislation is walking in the footsteps of giants and finishing a job and a legacy that was created by our fathers of the state. And I just wanted to show a couple of slides to just put this into perspective for folks of what we're talking about. Large-scale metallic sulfide mining. This is not your mom and pop mining. This is not your placer mines. This is a large industrialization of a low-grade ore that requires an incredible amount of volume to be processed. And this is where we got concerned. In fact, many of us, Christina and I both, were supportive of this project at the very beginning. We didn't know what it entailed until we learned and educated ourselves and became aware. When I started doing these presentations, I would talk about Bingham Canyon as an example of a large-scale mine that would be similar in size and scale. What I didn't know is that I'd also be showing slides of where those things have failed. And this was the landslide. I don't know if many have heard of this, but at the mine site, I think it was a year ago or so, they had a massive landslide that they had somewhat predicted, although it buried many of their trucks and basically rendered the mine out of operation for, I still think it's not operating yet, I don't know. But a massive, massive catastrophe. And this is what is possible. This is what we're talking about when we're putting things at risk. And this is a risk-reward analysis. What are we putting at risk and for what reward? And I've talked to many of you. I recognize a lot of faces from presentations we've done specifically about the threats of Pebble Mine and the issue in the region. I'm happy to not go through that entire litany tonight because now we're talking about things that we can do and actions we can take to safeguard ourselves and not fall into the same pitfalls that we've done elsewhere in this country. Most recently, outside of our country, I should say, the Mount Poly disaster. Many of you have heard about this on the news. This was a huge tailings dam failure that just happened at the headwaters of the Fraser River. This is exactly what we're talking about when we want to add a layer of protection to this fishery. We do not find that it is acceptable for us to go blindly into the wind and trust all of the science from the companies that are purporting to do it for their own profits. We want to have a public review. We want to have a meaningful process where Alaskans can engage on this issue, on any issue that would threaten the fishery of Bristol Bay, because it's a statewide significant resource and has a far-reaching effect on our state's economy. The reason this is so special is that Bristol Bay is special and a gem inside of itself. It is the most productive wild salmon fishery left on planet Earth. And this is just a map from the Wild Salmon Center that highlights the densities of salmon around the area. And you can see the watershed is highlighted here. This is Bristol Bay. So this is a unique solution for a unique place, and we support Ballot Measure 4 for that reason.
Thank you. Deantha?
Okay, well, thank you very much. My name is Deantha Crockett. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Miners Association. AMA has been around since 1939. We're the trade association that represents mineral interests in the state. We've got about 1,800 members that range from Nome down to Ketchikan, so we're a statewide, very diverse organization. You've heard about what Ballot Measure 4 entails, and I'm here to tell you why I think you should vote no on it. So Ballot Measure 4, I think it creates uncertainty and politicizes our scientific process. The problem with ballot initiatives, mostly, all the time, is that there's just too many unknowns. I think the intent is good. I think that Christina and Anders probably do want to protect salmon, but we can't trust that their intentions are actually how the law will be implemented and what we'll see carried out. I think the law is the law, and we have a sound, stringent permitting process because of that. In Rich's opening statements, he's going to review our permitting process and what it takes to permit a project like Pebble in his talks, but I assure you it is a very stringent process, and I think that when you have undefined and unclear standards, like in the language that Dick referred, what has the potential to adversely affect mean? Who decides that? Again, there's just too many unknowns. I think it sets a bad precedent and provides an avenue for this type of action to be anywhere else in Alaska with any other project. It's not just mining, it's not just Bristol Bay, and it's curious why you would choose to just focus on Bristol Bay in an initiative like this. Why not the Copper River? Why not the Kuskokwim? Why not Cook Inlet? I think it imposes a huge burden on the legislature and the permitting agencies with no added benefit. These people are busy, and they should be. They're making laws, they're regulating projects, and they absolutely should be busy. But to put an additional burden on them that doesn't continually or more so benefit us is not necessary. And finally, the uncertainty, again, it jeopardizes investment and development in Alaska's economy. We need clear and predictable permitting standards to attract investment here. I think when companies look at our state, when we pass a law like this, does it signal we're open for investment, or does it signal that we don't want projects to come here? So I appreciate Dick and Anders both going through the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. I just wanted to make a couple of points about it. It was enacted in 1972. It initially contained mineral leases in the language, but throughout the process of it going through the legislature, mineral claims were struck from the legislation. Interestingly, Governor Egan didn't sign it. In his signing statement, which I do admit I paraphrased, it is quite a long signing statement, but he said, "I'd ordinarily be extremely reluctant to accept the sort of legislation usurpation of the administrative read agency's function represented in this legislation. However, Bristol Bay salmon runs are a massive and uniquely valuable renewable resource. I can't find too unacceptable the notion of a limited fisheries reserve in northern Bristol Bay. In consideration of the above noted observations, I am permitting the legislation to become law without my signature." My take on this, the Deantha Crockett read of this, is that Governor Egan thought, I think this is bad policy. I do value Bristol Bay salmon. I'm not going to sign the bill into law, but I'm not going to veto it either. And without a veto, the bill eventually became law. Looking into this, it really does go beyond the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. It comes into a different industry later in the game. I think when it passed, the oil and gas statute did pass when no valid leases were held, and anybody considering having a lease in the area was put on notice that this is a factor you'll have to deal with. Now at this point, putting this into the equation, you have a claim holder, a mineral claim holder in the area that spent over $500 million exploring and doing environmental studies. And to change and add this change late in the game, it doesn't just put us at a disadvantage, and that goes back to my point about jeopardizing investment, but it's simply unfair. And then there's a little matter about it being unconstitutional. In Dick's description, he did mention that there was litigation brought that was recently brought by Rich and my organization, along with another mining entity, another mining association in the state. And what we looked at when we did that was that oil and gas leases in the reserve activities never really gotten to a point for it to be challenged. So that language has never been tested in the courts. So it's an unknown if even the existing law is legal. Should it ever be challenged, it may not stand up in court. What we also looked at was special and local legislation. You have one set of rules for one area in the state and another set for another area. Permitting standards are that standard. They should be standard. They should be uniform. Oh, I'm at 2 minutes. I better hurry. The other major concern is that separation of powers. I have this graph. You've all seen it. You all saw it in 7th grade or so. But this is the basic concept of checks and balances and how our government operates. The legislature makes the laws. The executive branch administers the laws. Judicial, and I think we can all agree that judicial will be involved multiple times should Pebble become a permitted project, is also involved. So to go back, ask the legislature again, the laws you created or your body created, the laws the agencies carried out, now do you still agree with it? It's an additional layer that doesn't help us out. Like Dick said, if ballot measure 4 is adopted, I'm sorry, Dick, I don't mean to quote you on this. Dick said this isn't just about Pebble. Now this is my quote. It won't stop Pebble. If the Pebble project is deemed detrimental to the environment, I believe the project proponent would stop it before, and if not, I'm certain that the agencies in charge would stop it, excuse me. If it does make it to the legislature, it will have received hundreds of permits that it needed to get from the federal and state agencies, and denial at that point would be purely political. Finally, here's the reasons, just to reiterate why I think you should vote no. And I think just from a more broad perspective, issues like this are too complex to discuss in the initiative process. I think it's great to have forums like this, but I have an inkling, first of all, that not a large percentage of the population shows up to these. And second of all, I think many of you have probably made your mind up and you're here for support. So it's very hard to have this discussion with the voters in Alaska and the citizenry as a whole. So we have a legislative process in place to make sure that these laws that are being created are done for the greater good. So with that, I would encourage you to vote no on 4.
Okay, thank you, Deantha. Christina.
Hello. My Yupik name is Nuruya, and my English name is Christina Salmon. I am the granddaughter of John and Mary Olympic and the eldest daughter of Dan and Julie Salmon. I was born and raised in Igyagig, where the pure waters of Lake Iliamna feed the Kwijak River, a river that this year alone boasted a sockeye salmon run of 4.4 million. I wear many hats in my community. I'm manager of an environmental company. I sit on numerous boards. I'm a small business owner, but most importantly, I'm a mother to 3. My upbringing taught me to be a hard-working, environment-respecting individual. From the time we were born, respect for the earth who supported us, elders who educated us, and animals who nurtured us were instilled in all the youth in our community. Also instilled in us was the understanding of our role in protecting the land and resources that kept us alive and healthy. I was not anti-Pebble from the start. In fact, I spent almost 2 years in Iliamna working for them. Coming from such a small community with limited work opportunities in our region, I knew too well what it was like to see families struggling and depending on welfare and food stamps. Through the years, I learned enough to understand this mine could have devastating effects to our way of life. This is why I signed on as a sponsor of Ballot Measure 4. Ballot Measure 4 will put in place an additional level of protection for land and waters that have sustained our way of life for many generations. If a project will not endanger Bristol Bay, then Ballot Measure 4 will not stop it. The measure will provide a necessary safeguard against any project that will destroy a priceless resource. So that is why I'm asking you to vote yes on ballot measure 4. It's a vote not only for salmon, but for our way of life.
Thank you. Rich?
My name's Richard Hughes, and my biography's in the handout, so I'm not going to go into that in the interest of time. My presentation will deal with the permitting process that the state of Alaska employs to permit large projects, not just mines, but large projects, including mines. The state of Alaska has a state-of-the-art permitting process that originated in the legislature with the creation of the Office of Project Management and Permitting. This agency coordinates the efforts of the permitting agencies within the state, as well as the federal government, the local communities, and the Native organizations as required. The departments involved with the permitting process include the Natural Resources, DEC, the Fish and Game, Department of Commerce, and so forth. Federal agencies include EPA, BLM, Corps of Engineers, Park Services as necessary, and the Forest Service. I must have gone too far. Here we go. The Department of Natural Resources handles plans of operations, reclamation plan approvals, rights-of-ways, mill site leases, Title 41 permits which involve fish-bearing streams, water appropriation, dam safety certification, and so forth. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation handles wastewater permits, domestic and non-domestic wastewater disposal permits, the Alaska DES wastewater discharge standards compliance, the Corps of Engineers 404 certification, stormwater discharge, and so on. The list goes on pretty extensively. The Department of Fish and Game gets involved when the project is in a state refuge, sanctuary, or critical habitat. Any activity within the area will require a Fish and Game certification or permit. The Department of Revenue issues mining licenses, and the Army Corps of Engineers handles wetlands. And the EPA it gets involved in that issue also, as we know from yesterday's hearings. And the Section 7 consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries for the threatened and endangered species is involved in that. This slide is simply a summary of what I was just talking about. I'm not going to go into details here. We just would be redundant in that process. Whether you can read that or not, I don't know, but the intent here is to try to show what a typical project's schedule would look like. The first item is initial exploration, followed by advanced exploration, environmental studies, preliminary feasibility, feasibility studies, permitting, and this is a pretty short line actually compared to what it can be. This line can be years long. In fact, Pebble's been in process for over 20 years. Kensington project down by Juneau, over 20 years, including court cases and so forth. And ordinarily, this is going to extend also by a couple of years because of all the lawsuits that are involved in the permitting aspects of it. Nevertheless, this shows atypical projects permitting. The bottom line here is the length of time from discovery here at 0 to operations, which is 13 and a half years in this case, and this is an efficient process. This is what what is generated in the permitting process with the state of Alaska. This is a compilation of all the studies that are undertaken for a typical project. This happens to be POGO. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, kicks in whenever a major federal action is undertaken. And in any large mine, that would create the NEPA process to kick in. And that means that the EPA, the Corps of Engineers, BLM, if BLM's involved, or the Forest Service, if they're involved, are going to be major players. They always require a environmental assessment, but most mines now skip that process and go directly to a environmental impact statement. The timeline is generally dependent on the NEPA process. An EIS is a disclosure document prepared so agencies undertaking decisions on a project are fully informed, and an EIS is not a decision document. The NEPA process is part of the Clean Water Act, Section 404, is involved, as well as the Forest Service's plan of operation if it happens to be on Forest Service lands. The process involves scoping, a draft environmental impact statement, comments, final EIS, and records of decision published in the National Register. Baseline, I'm going to skip to the next one. The baseline studies involved in the review include this long list of items. The next issue is financial assurance. All mines are required to have a reclamation a plan, and that it requires a bond, letter of credit, cash, collateral, or so forth to fund the reclamation should the mine operator fail and not do his work. And that is a legally collectible item. And a few of the currently existing bonds in place in the state right now include Greens Creek at $65 million. Red Dog, $305 million, if you can imagine that. That's because it requires monitoring perpetuity. Fort Knox, $98 million, and so forth. The total bond amount at this time is $586 million. And the last item, I'm going to skip to that one and go to this one, is the dam safety issue. The dam safety is obviously a very important point and requires a lot of items be studied in the certification for dam construction. And those are depicted on this slide, and I'm going to have to leave it at that.
Was that it?
Am I out of time?
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry. And the fishing game makes sure that fish swim properly.
Okay, the next part of the forum is where the supporters get to ask questions of the opponents and vice versa, and we're going to switch back and forth, start with the supporters here asking opponents questions, then switch back to the other way, then go back the other way, so it'll be 2 rounds of each, and each round will be 10 minutes, and we ask that you keep your questions to a minute and the response to 2 minutes, and then whoever's asking the question has 30 seconds to rebut the response, and those things will be timed so we can get through it. So, Anders, you want to lead off with?
Sure. I know, quickly trying to write down as much as I could off of those slides. There's quite a bit there to follow. I guess one of my first questions would be on the latest thing that Mr. Hughes was just speaking about. We don't believe that the permitting process itself in the individual categories, it's very detailed, obviously. There are a lot of permits and a lot of hoops that everybody has to jump through. I want to make sure that people understand that this level of review would happen after a permitting process. So there would be another level of review of the cumulative effect of all of these individual permits. These permits are happen in a silo, each individual, approval for this, approval for that. And what we're looking for is the cumulative effect and an overall view of what that would constitute as a danger. And my question is, if the legislature was wise enough to create this very rigorous permitting process that you tout, then why would they not be wise enough to review the final determination and see if this is something that would have an adverse effect on the fishery? I don't understand the disconnect between their ability to review those permits that they've been able to create in the first place.
Any questions directed to whom?
To you. Either one, yeah.
Can we both answer whenever
Sure.
appropriate?
Yeah, we have 2 minutes between the two of you.
Okay.
Well, simply, the legislature has its job to do, and that's make laws. And the enforcement of those laws and the execution of those laws passes to the administration. The legislature that does not have the technical capability to handle the permit reviews that is established within the administration. Would you like to add to that?
Sure. I think, what we have, and at least what I've been experiencing since I started my career, is you have a legislature that's in a 90-day session. They're scrambling. It's very, very hard to get things done as it is. And that's certainly not being critical of them. It's just they've got a lot on their plate. Imagine trying to get something like this passed during the last session when oil taxes were being debated and others, and a project is simply waiting for its approval. They've already gotten all of their permit approvals, and they're simply waiting for a box to be checked by the legislature. Again, the legislature has to go to the agencies that have already evaluated and approved and say, yes, we're still okay with this. I think that wait time is very dangerous. Time is money. People are waiting to go to work, and that is just the wait time is a big trouble for me.
I guess my response on that would be, and this goes back to one of your previous statements, was that this makes it a political thing, not a scientific question, and said that the legislature is very busy and burdened with all these other things. I mean, that basically downplays that this is not a significant thing that's going to happen in our state, and this is not important. Putting the world's largest earthen dams on top of the world's largest fishery seems to me to be an important enough issue that the legislature should take some time to review this and have an additional review on that. I don't think that demeaning that or belittling the importance of the issue and saying that they're busy with other things is a very appropriate statement. And I still think that if they're going to take the chance to review it, what it's doing is allowing our public process to take place where we as Alaskans have a say in these projects that are so massive and so large scale that they affect all of us in some way or another. The fishery has an impact that far reaches into the state, from tourism to commercial fishing to subsistence fishing. I think it's an important enough issue that we should be looking at the cumulative effect of all of these individual permits after they've gone through the permitting process. We'd also be letting them know this. Sorry, thank you. You have this for us?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the comments was that it jeopardizes investment. I guess that follows up what I was just saying. If Pebble has not submitted any plan, then are we not putting this out in front of them at appropriate time? Is this not the time to put forth these kind of questions that we all want to have answered in this ability to have a public process? How would that jeopardize investment if the mines and proposals for Bristol Bay knew that they had to follow this additional review? It's not a surprise. It doesn't come to them afterwards. It's an additional review.
I think my point is that it comes after they have spent a tremendous amount of time and resources exploring the area and doing as much environmental baseline study as they possibly can. So they've already done a huge investment. None of us will ever see $500 million in our lives. I'm pretty certain I won't. And this company has expended that to understand the area, to know not only what's going on with the deposit, but what's going on with the environment, to see if it's something they can do. So an additional change in the regulatory structure, even if there's not a permit applied for, there's still the investment there. And to change it at that point, it could have been something that the company may have not made that investment initially, and that is what we find unfair.
Yeah. If a company's already invested $500 million and one company had and walked away from that investment because they thought it was a bad idea, is it still not fair? I mean, they still have the ability to walk away from these projects. It's their burden to prove that they won't hurt the fishery. I don't really feel bad if they have to spend so much money to make what could be a $500 billion profit, supposedly. That's a huge number, and I don't think it's unfair that Alaskans should ask them to spend some money to make sure on the front side that we're not putting this fishery at risk, even if it costs them a couple more dollars. I was curious about, when you look at all the permits, Richard, do you find that, I've been told this before, there's 62 individual permits, and most of these permits to me sit in a individual silo each. It's, can I fill this area? Can I dredge this? Can I get a road here? Is there a permit that you know of that takes into account the effect of all of those permits together, given together? Is there a net end of the line for the permitting process?
Absolutely, and that's part of the environmental impact statement. The cumulative effects are considered in that document.
But that's not a decision document, right?
No, it's a definitive document. But it does lead to the permitting process, which is the ROD, which in turn feeds into the permit itself.
Right, I guess I go back to the fact that that's still, the EIS would not be a decision-making process, it's just a guidance document. So in the end, there's still no one where the public is making a full process decision on this. It's just being handled by agency folks in a certain division, which basically doesn't allow for public input at any meaningful level. That's all the questions I have right at this time.
Okay.
I'll probably come up with more.
Okay. Deantha or Rich, questions?
My first question, it can be for both of you or whoever would like to answer it, is what specifically in our permitting process do you think is lacking that you think this would change? I guess that's kind of two questions. Forget the second part. I'll ask the first question. What is lacking in our current permitting process?
My theory goes back to the same question, or the same answer question I asked you. There's no end result to evaluate the effect of all of these individual permits as a whole. We're going to allow people to make decisions, and basically the permitting process, in my mind, is a take-home test. You're allowed to submit an application for a permit. They'll review it. They'll tell you what they need to adjust and what you need to change, and that's the way it should be. It should be a back and forth, a working process. But in the end, there's no one saying, all right, you've got this permit to dredge here, you've got this permit to build this road. Where's the permit that says, should we do it and all? I see the could permits, can we do this, can we do this, but where's the should? Is this going to have a bad effect overall? Is this the right thing to do in general? There is no net end result that evaluates the impact of all of those permits together. And this is what we're looking for, is that end answer where somebody takes us a moment to review the entire process, everything that's been done, hold it in a public light, allow all of us to see as opposed to being handled in an agency decision, and allow Alaskans input.
So hearing you talk just now, all I could think of was that I think the permitting process is actually a really misleading term. We talk about it like it's one thing, it's the process. The process is really very long, as Rich demonstrated, tedious process that goes over many months and years. So it's not just this one thing that happened. It's a back and forth, like you said, and I'm glad you think that's good, because so do we. The agency is talking to the project proponents to make it the best possible project, but it's tons of agencies, tons of permits, all involved that gets you to that end run. So there is not just one check result at the end. There's lots and lots and lots of check results along the way. So the process is really a very long, lengthy period of time in which all of those milestones had to be met to move forward.
My answer on that too, or response would be, an example would be Rock Creek Mine up in Nome. This is a project that went through the permitting process, and as soon as it had been permitted, was in the ground and project was going. But then it faltered on its own account for several different reasons. I'm sure you know all of them. I think milling process, power problems, a few economic problems. That to me was a red flag when this all happened, when we were already fighting for protecting Bristol Bay. That here's a project that just went through the rigorous permitting process, yet still failed on its own. Should it not have been, if it's a rigorous enough process, should it not have held up and held true and stayed in business? I don't understand why that would have closed if it had gone through it.
Are we allowed to rebut rebuttals?
Yeah, in that case, because that was
Because I want to go back to the other questions.
you can rebut that rebuttal because that was actually an extra rebuttal.
You're talking about Rock Creek
If you want to respond to Rock Creek real briefly.
Rock Creek is, you can't dictate the economics, and that's the gold price. The gold price goes south, so is the economics. Nothing we get about it.
I think there's a number of different things at play. The gold price did go south, and that's what caused the mine to cease operations, absolutely. But I think there was a design flaw in the Rock Creek issue, and I think the monitoring played safe there. There was not an environmental catastrophe because the monitoring, the right agencies went up there, they contacted the operator and said, this has to be fixed now, and we didn't have an environmental disaster. And that's exactly the check and balance that should be in place.
Okay, let's get to the next question. Deantha or Rich, next question.
Sure. You showed a slide of the Bingham Canyon operations landslide, and I realized that there was a massive landslide in a horrible failure there. Can you tell me what environmental damage that did?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
What environmental damage that did?
I don't know if I could answer you what environmental damage that had, other than probably economic damage to the communities, workers that were there were put out of work.
The slide, in fact, buried a few pieces of operating equipment and shut the operation down for a fairly significant length of time. They knew the slide was developing and had monitored it, thank goodness, so they were able to get their people out of the way before that slide failed and inundated the pit. Now the operation's back running at this time.
Next question.
It kind of relates to the Bingham Canyon question. I thought it was interesting that you called that a catastrophe, because I really don't think it is. But I think what is a catastrophe is the Mount Poly. I think it's an awful thing. It's that picture and the videos are very gut-wrenching. And I think it's important to move forward. I'm kind of grandstanding, my apologies. I'll get to my question, though. I think it's important to actually monitor everything that could have possibly happened there and to learn from it. And I'm wondering if you think a legislative approval would have stopped that incident from happening.
How the can you say the last part, how you think the
A
legislative?
legislative approval, like what is being suggested in ballot measure 4, do you believe that would have stopped an incident like Mount Poly from happening?
I can't say that I would know that it would. I think it would probably answer the question of whether we should put our most valuable wild salmon fishery at risk under such a dam. I believe, if I'm not wrong, that the engineering firm that designed the Mount Poly Dam was also the same engineering firm that designed the Pebble dams and the preliminary reports that they came out with in their economic feasibility. And it was also cited by Tom Collier as an example of a tailings dam that was holding through and living symbiotically with the fishery. I believe they're probably changing that statement now, or he's pointing fingers to the engineering firm. So I still think there's this huge level of risk there that's still going to be associated with it.
Well, you know, the state of Alaska, in fact, we met with the state to discuss this Mount Poly issue, and nobody knows at this point what the cause of that was. The state is going to follow that issue very closely and learn from what happened there so that is not repeated. That is a horrible event, of course.
Another question?
If I include in that rebuttal, can I do that?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to add on to what Rich said. I don't know the answer to the question I asked you either, Anders. I don't know if legislative approval would have stopped that, but I think something that we can do, and I'm hopeful that you agree, is taking the lessons learned when the investigation is complete on it. Would we be able to work together and see what lessons are learned from that incident and look at our current permitting process and see, yes, are these laws in place, like our dam safety program, sufficient, or what does need to be fixed?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think we should be doing that at all levels because we have permitting of mines all across the state, and we have a great, robust mining industry across the state that we support. I think our big issue falls when these things overlap with our renewable resources of our salmon. And do we believe that when we have that conflict in this state, that there should be a process that we get to evaluate whether that's an appropriate risk for, for us as Alaskans to take? And so I guess that's my answer back on that. And one thing you brought up was also that there was no economic viability of that one project, or that was an issue. I guess question then, why don't we have an economic viability permit? I mean, it seems like a common question. Can you make this work economically?
You want to respond to his rebuttal, to your rebuttal, or do you want to ask another question, either one?
I can't keep track of that either.
The economics are considered by the mine in the initial approach, of course, but the environmental impact statement does include a socioeconomic and a financial viability statement.
Do you want to say more, or you want another question?
No, actually, do you have any more questions? I want to let the audience ask them.
We don't have any more questions.
I want the audience to ask.
Okay, we have, there's cards being collected from the audience for if anybody out there has questions, but we are set up to go back for another round of questions here between the panelists. If Anders, do you guys have any more questions you want to ask?
I guess I'm just wondering if they don't think that it would be fair that a mine project wouldn't endanger the fishery, that you require a level of review that would say, is it possible that this would risk the fishery? Is that not an appropriate question to ask? Somewhere in the process, a final approval, that would this, because as we looked at mines in Bristol Bay, we've always said that they would not risk the fishery for a mine. So is it not fair that we then ask them if your project would put this fishery at risk, and can you explain to us in a public fashion? Is that not a fair question to ask?
I completely don't understand. I'm so sorry. I'm not trying to be flippant. I don't understand. To ask the project proponent, you mean?
Right. So if isn't it fair to require that a mine project not endanger the fishery? So isn't it a fair question to ask the mine to say, or ask people to say, would this project risk the fishery? Is that not a fair question to ask somewhere in this process? Because right now I don't believe we asked that specific question.
I don't think we ask the question, we require it. It's not something the mine project has an opportunity to answer. They have an obligation to meet.
Anders, any other questions? You guys have any other questions of the proponents before we get into public questions?
No, we're good.
Okay. With that, we'll turn to questions from the public. And the way we're going to respond to these is I'll ask the questions. Some of them are directed to specific people, but if they're more a general question, I will direct it to the specific person. The first question is for, I guess, both sides to address. I guess I need to speak closer to the microphone. This question is, if the legislature is allowed to veto a project that has received all the required permits, should the legislature also be able to vote to allow a project to go forward that has been denied a permit? If not, why not? Who'd like to answer that first? Rich looks like he's ready to.
I think I understood the question. Let me give it a whirl, and you can fill in for me. I guess the legislature wouldn't approve a project if it was a bad project because it'd never get that far. And in fact, the agencies within the state and the federal agencies would not ever allow a project to receive permits from the state or the feds, so it would never get to the state process.
I totally agree. And I don't think our legislature should be able to advance one that wasn't approved by technical agencies. I think that's inappropriate.
I think we agree on that.
Okay.
Yay!
Then the next question is specifically directed towards Rich. How long does it take to go through the EIS process, and does the public have a chance to review permits?
Yeah, in fact, the EIS process is very extensive, involves extensive public participation, just like the process yesterday at the Egan Center, where people had a chance to participate in the decision-making process with the EPA on the watershed assessment at Bristol Bay. So the public does participate and participate extensively and has the opportunity to submit written comments as well as oral comments for consideration.
I guess one question I have on that is if our comments, I know I've heard in the past, if you make a comment on a permitting process, it's basically that they have to consider the comments. They don't actually have to act on those comments. So it allows some public process, but it's not necessarily a meaningful level of where you can say whether something's right or wrong. I mean, it's just a review for people to consider. It's something for them to consider. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Next question is, if this initiative is so fair for Pebble, then should the legislature be required to approve other projects post-permitting, such as the gas line? Anders, you want to?
Well, I guess that it's all relative to where we are. This is a geographically specific initiative for the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve only. So that would be a separate question left up to people who would maybe want to have some additional review on a gas line permit process across the whole state. But that was not, I don't think you could do that personally because you don't have a fisheries reserve in existence there. You know, we're able to do this because the reserve is there. We're trying to protect it.
Oh.
Rich?
We're fighting over the mic here. I don't think the legislature should have an opportunity to veto any project for the same reasons that I pointed out in my opening statements. I also don't think that any region of this state is more special than others. I think that no matter where it is and no matter what kind of project it is, it needs to go through the permitting process, period, and prove itself that it will be safe, safe for the environment, safe for the fishery. Otherwise, it shouldn't go through legislative approval or not, region or not.
Okay. Another question is, can the legislature, under this authority, change permit conditions as part of its approval? And if so, how would that impact the NEPA process? Anders?
Yeah, I don't believe that it would allow them to change the permitting process. At this point, when you'd get under this initiative, the permits would have to have already been issued. The permit process would have had to play out until this would happen was going forth, the review. Unless there was some interaction that, maybe the DNR can write the regulations for, as you know, ongoing. There's permit processes that are ongoing. So I would imagine that there would be some ability for projects to amend permits and do things within that scope, but before they could run this process, it would all need to be approved through the permitting process originally.
I'm glad Anders answered that, because I think that's something that's in the intent of the initiative sponsor, I think, and that goes back to what I said in the beginning, is what is the intent, and after it's voted into law, how does the courts and other people implement it, how is it carried out by the agencies, and how do the courts interpret what the language is? So who knows?
Okay, now the next question is, why is the establishment of special areas with different permitting rules objectionable, given that they already exist in the form of state parks, game refuges, state forests, etc.? And is it not a legislative prerogative to establish such areas, as both state and federal legislators have done historically? Anders, you want to start with that one?
I just agree. I think it is their obligation to duty, and they have done that, and that's how we created the Fisheries Reserve. We're just asking them to make that law more inclusive, to include mineral leases and review in the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve.
Deantha?
Do you want to repeat it for Rich?
Oh,
I
the question
I
is,
didn't get it all the way.
why is the establishment of special areas with different permitting rules objectionable, given that they already exist in the form of state parks, game refuges, state forests, etc.? And is it not a legislative prerogative to establish such areas, as both state and federal legislators have done historically?
I think I would like to fall back on my previous statement. I think we need to, if we want to spend some energy reviewing the permitting process, ensure that and I firmly believe it is, but ensure that it's right for every area of the state. I think if there's a concern, it needs to be fixed no matter where it is, and ensure that every inch of the state is protected and not just a special area.
Rich, did you want to add to that?
I think that they could have the right to designate a special area, no question about it. But I still think that moving the permitting process, approval process to the legislature is a separations of powers issue and a usurpation of the authority of the state administrators.
Which hasn't been decided in the courts quite yet, as you pointed out.
Okay, given that the corporate duty is to its shareholders, what will keep the corporation from cutting corners on implementation? We have seen most enforcement agencies' budgets politically cut in the past. How can enforcement be ensured?
Cutting corners on what?
On enforcement.
So
Or cutting corners on implementation, excuse me. And the question is kind of, is there adequate enforcement out there to enforce the rules or permits that are issued?
It's asking for enforcement by regulatory agencies.
Yeah,
And how can we ensure that's done?
yeah.
I believe that it is done, but I think if there's a person in this room that doesn't believe so, you should talk to your legislator about if it is and isn't, how you believe it is and isn't, and ask for change in the statute or change in the law and the regulation. And that's what you have a legislative official for. That's why you elect them, is to create laws. And if that's something lacking out there, if you believe something is lacking out there, ask them to propose legislation to change it.
The regulatory agencies, DNR, DEC, and so forth, have a job to do, which is monitoring. If they're not doing that job, then the rules need to be enforced, I should say, enhanced, and people in there need to be removed. That's pure, plain and simple.
Anders?
I guess this is one of the main reasons we're concerned about some of these issues. In the instance of Pebble, we've had examples where they made withdrawals of water where they were not permitted. They apparently had to self-report this because it was brought to their attention. Again, there was not enough level of enforcement. There weren't enough people on the ground checking to find out where they were drawing water from to see if they were accurately doing it with their permits. There was other issues where diesel fuel was spilled on the Iliamna Hall Road, and things were swept under the rug and handled and paid for and done outside of any kind of agency review. These are kind of some of the examples that we've had in the past that raised our hackles and got us aware that we need to be extra careful and have extra scrutiny on this.
I guess my follow-up question to that would be, though, how does this initiative add extra enforcement or monitoring?
Well, I think at the end when you say, is there a risk to this fishery? That's the determination that we're going to have to make, and that's going to be determined, and Deantha made this comment before, is, there's unclear standards and who decides, and I think it is clear. I think it's clear that the legislature has an ability to make a decision. They'll be able to call experts from both sides. They'll be able to pull in all of the experts that have worked on anything. They can ask any question they want, and they can review it all at some level. And hopefully, by adding these things, I don't think there's any clear silver bullet that eliminates all risks in this world that we live in. But adding some level of review certainly helps that.
Deantha or Rich, any response on that?
I do not agree with that. I think the role of the legislature is to create laws and to appropriate money. And if for some reason at some point there was a person that believed that enforcement wasn't happening, you would go to your legislator and say, I don't believe enforcement is happening. I don't think the language in ballot measure 4 that puts a legislative approval at the end of a permitting process would do anything to enhance enforcement.
And I have to agree with that.
Okay, the next question is the legislature better able to evaluate environmental impacts of a project than a scientist or a permit agency? If so, why? Either side want to, Anders, you want to?
I don't know if it's a question of whether it's better at it or not. Its job is to take and to evaluate all of those people's decisions that they've made. All these professional people and everybody's hired to do all these evaluations, all of these great people who are working very diligently on this. It's a legislator's job to take a look at the bigger picture. I want them to see how this affects people across the board. And I want them to have a process where they're open and allow people, the public, to come in and comment on it. I don't want to see these decisions made by a few agency people, even if they are highly qualified. I want to have a process where the public is involved. We've lost a lot of our public ability in this state in recent years to ability to have input on things that are affecting in our communities. And I don't think that putting some of that back out there is really a big problem. I think that's an added advantage, and it just makes us a stronger state. That's my short answer on that. I could keep going.
Well, I think the permitting process does involve the public to the maximum extent possible. I've yet to see a mine operation in the state that hasn't had extensive public review processes, and every one of them has, and it's an educational process. So I just fail to see where this is going to have an improvement on the permitting process.
I think unless the legislator in question is a scientist, the answer is absolutely not.
Okay. This question deals with kind of financial assurances question that Rich touched on. Given the occurrence of the Mount Poly mine breach in Canada and concern that a mine company may not have enough insurance to cover reclamation, how can we be assured that the mine would be properly insured to cover damages should they occur? How does the current permitting process protect the public? Rich, do you want to take that one to start with?
Well, I'll try to address the financial assurance question in a little more depth, and you might have to steer me back to the basis there. But there's a very extensive review process within DNR on every large project to determine what the reclamation requirements might be. The dam safety office has a requirement that the projects have a contingency plan for failure. If in fact they do have a problem with a structure, the mine or the operation has to have a plan in place to respond to that event, and that of course would be while the mine is operating. The reclamation, which begins after a mine begins operating and kicks into high gear when the operation closes, is what the financial bonds are for, the financial requirements are for, to make sure that reclamation happens. And that would include any structures such as a tailings dam or whatever it might be that could fail, and it has to ensure that those structures are in fact reclaimed.
Response? Okay, the next question, this is specifically addressed to Anders. I believe that all land is unique. Do you believe all proposed large-scale mining projects in the U.S. deserve to go through the same level of scrutiny? That is, do all projects deserve legislative approval? All large-scale mining projects.
across the country.
Yep, that's their question.
I think I've tried to make myself pretty clear, but I'll reiterate. We are concerned about the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. We're working to try and add protections for that particular region of the state. We've been working on that from the very beginning. I've long said and many times we are not against mining. There are many, many places in this country and in this world where mining can exist and do no harm to anything around it and operate in a perfectly responsible fashion, I believe. I think it's irresponsible, though, however, to put a renewable resource like salmon at risk without a very, very critical review of that. I think that that would be in our best interest as a state to conserve and protect those renewable resources that can long-standing provide economic stability to our future. And that's why we support Ballot Measure 4 that adds another level of review specifically for any large-scale mining project inside of the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve only, not other mines elsewhere in the state or anywhere else in the country.
Response from that side?
Well, again, the overview by the agencies for that permitting process is going to be extremely intense. So again, the legislature brings nothing to the show in this effort.
Amen.
Yeah, we've seen failures time and time again in mines across the country, and tailing dams and landslides and things have failed despite this rigorous process that we've all seen.
I don't believe we've seen mine failures time and time again across the country.
Excuse me? Again.
I don't believe we've seen mine failures time and time again across the country. The country of the United States?
Yeah, I think I've highlighted several of them. You know, across the country, across the continent, across the world, we've had issues with tailings dam failures across the world.
Across the world, I will concede that.
I guess this question is kind of related to that. Where in the history of metallic sulfide mining has a project provided the planned yield and then been rehabilitated?
Dick, I feel like I'm deaf today. I'm so sorry. Can you please repeat that?
Where in the history of metallic sulfide mining has a project provided the planned yield and then been rehabilitated?
I heard it. It just
There's a lot of echo. It's hard to understand sometimes up here.
You want me to repeat it again?
Sure.
Okay. Where in the history of metallic sulfide mining has a project provided the planned yield, so I guess produce as much minerals as they said they would, and then been rehabilitated, reclaimed?
An example was closure.
Where have mines closed and then been reclaimed?
Yeah.
Well,
No, after they've produced.
well,
Maybe you should break that in. Maybe you should just answer that second question, part of it, which is some of these questions are a little ambiguous, I guess. But this one, where in the history of metallic sulfide mining has a project been rehabilitated after it's been produced?
Illinois Creek is a good example. The reclamation effort there is impeccable, and it's a really classy reclamation project for the state of Alaska. Usability Coal is another one, although that's not metallic sulfide. But Usability is reclaiming their operation in a very credible manner.
I think we have countless examples in our state of mines that have closed, mines that are operating right now that do reclamation as they're operating. It's a very high standard. It's one that was required by law, but was done by our mines even before it was required by law, and we see it in the state all the time.
Anders or Christina, any response on that?
You know, I've seen many instances across the country, I guess, where there's been mines that have reached closure in arid areas and been reestablished. I've seen it before. I know it can be done in certain areas for sure. Yeah. I can see that.
Okay.
Those areas aren't the world's wildest salmon fishery.
If the legislature did approve a mine in Bristol Bay, what would protect the applicant from a group sponsoring a voter initiative to rescind that approval, like ballot measure 1 on SB 21? Anders, you want to tackle that
If it
one?
was approved, where would it be?
If the legislature approved it, what would prevent an initiative from coming back to rescind that approval?
A referendum I guess you'd have to ask a legal counsel on that one. I'm not sure the details on that, on where that would end up. But I would imagine it would be a form of a bill, so a referendum could be done if they wanted to. But again, that would be going against a public process. And I think, what's important is we just had this debate very loudly here in the state of Alaska recently with HB 77 that sought to remove some of this public process. And here we are, we're just trying to add a little bit of it back, and specifically not for the entire state, not all projects and not everything in the region. We've tried to narrow it down. I believe it's been narrowed down to a much more singular focus to address the real issue is, are we putting this fishery at risk? And is it an appropriate risk for us to take and for the state to have an opportunity to decide on that?
Deantha?
Dick, my understanding is that you cannot appeal a legislative decision like this. When you go through a permitting process, each time a permit is approved, the public has, first of all, an extensive amount of capacity to comment on it, but we see all the time litigation to stop permits being issued. I don't think there is a mechanism to appeal a legislative decision, so you really get yourself into a be careful what you ask for situation.
I guess to follow up on that, I guess maybe this is a question for the sponsors. Would the permitting or approval by the legislature occur after any sort of court litigation or before that? And if it occurred before litigation was resolved, could that actually affect the ability to file litigation? Like Deantha says, if the legislature actually approves something, can you actually go back to the courts then at that point?
Another good question probably for a lawyer on that level, because I'm not a lawyer and I probably shouldn't answer those kind of questions, but I would assume that at any point it's up to the proponent to submit this application and this bill to the legislature. So, I mean, it would be up to them to decide if they wanted to do it before or after they've gone through any litigation. If they were choosing to do that with litigation pending, I would think that would be a risk on their half to take that. But, I mean, we'd have to cross that bridge or see how that would pan out. I don't know the answer specifically.
Deantha, any follow-up? Or Rich?
No, we're not lawyers either.
Okay. This question was kind of partly addressed, but since somebody asked it again, what will the legislative examination and subsequent approval bring to the table that the normal permitting process does not? Legislatures don't seem to be as expert as those who already review, plus have political agendas. Anders?
Well, I guess, I hear this a lot about, politicizing, a permitting process. And I think it's naive of us with our heads in the sand to think that the permitting process isn't political already. I mean, people are appointed, people are put in positions of approving permits, of being in charge of these things. I mean, we live in a political world. This is a part of democracy. It's not always clean. It's a little messy. But to say that there's not politics going on behind all of these things and these approvals aren't being done with some political influence, I believe to be a naive statement of anybody who understands the way our whole government system works. Having that review and at that end, I think it's only fair that we take a broad scale evaluation and allow the public to have more input in on those decisions. I think that to make a comment about the 30-day or the permitting, when you get a chance to comment on a permit, you have 30 days. And I was just curious, at a show of hands, how many people have commented on a large-scale mine permit ever in this state? I mean, I can't imagine it's a ton, but in this room, I would imagine we have some. So that's good. That's a pretty good turnout. Amongst many of my peers, I would say that number is 0. It's just not something that's popularly done, and this is a way to force that out into the public again and get people participating.
Deantha or Rich?
Anders had 2 answers, so I'll have 2 answers. My answer to the question, which is, does the legislature bring anything else to the table? I think the only thing they bring to the table is extra time, and maybe that's the intent of the initiative. Extra time that it takes, I mean. To answer, about the 30-day comment period, I will tell you that in my committees that I manage at Alaska Miners Association, we have 8 comment periods that we're working on right now that have 30-day notices. The EPA EPA hearing that we've referenced a couple times that occurred last night has a number of comment periods that were 30 days. 30 days is a standard thing, and I hate it too. I'm sure you would like a longer comment period, and maybe that's something else we can work on together, because it is a short amount of time. It is something that we all have jobs and we still have to take the time out to do. But it's fair, it's across the board, it's standard, and it's consistent. We're all dealing with it. So whenever we're working on issues that we think impact us, we've all got comment periods that are the same.
Okay, this next question I guess would be addressed towards Anders or Christina. There was an indication that the legislature approves other sorts of things of this nature. What are they?
I didn't know if I said anything like that. I guess they have the right to approve oil and gas leases if they were applied for, but that has not been done. So, I mean, that's the only similarity. I don't know of any other situation where the legislature has an obligation that has been dictated by law, like the existing fisheries reserve. It's a unique, there's only one reserve in the country, in the state of Alaska, and it's ours. It's right there. It's Bristol Bay.
Any?
No.
Okay. What kind of guarantee, I guess this would be addressed towards Deantha or Rich, what kind of guarantee can we have that the Earth Dam will not break over a period of several generations in light of history?
Getting back to the competence of the dam safety engineer, in fact, not just them, but the competence of the staff that work for the mining company and the permit requirements that they have to follow to monitor those dams as they operate them. At closure, the dams are inactivated. There's no reason to monitor a dam after the mine has been closed, unless it's going to be used for water storage. In which case, then monitoring would be a ongoing requirement and would have to be part of the financial assurance that I tried to talk about in one of my slides.
Yeah, I believe those tailing dams are meant to last for perpetuity, is what we've been told. So I would certainly hope that there's monitoring of those dams anywhere in the state for perpetuity. And I believe that obligation, if companies go bankrupt or leave, and which they typically do, would eventually fall back on the burden of the state or whoever is the original landholder in the area.
Okay. Next question, says question for yes. How can you claim a lack of cumulative effects when NEPA requires a big picture look and supports a record of decision? It is one end answer and always includes a no action alternative.
My answer on that, I guess, if I can answer correctly, is that that's still just a guidance document. There's no actual record of decision. No one person no public official who's held accountable to the people of Alaska would have to put their name on that approval. And I think that's what we're really asking for, is that we want accountability for these big decisions, and we want to have an ability to be part of that process. And the way we do that is through our legislature and putting them on the table and having to say yes or no whether they support this or not, instead of hiding behind an agency decision or a long-winded document that's just a guidance document.
Response? Richard, yeah. Okay. Could the mine permitting process be improved and made even more state-of-the-art if coastal zone management were restored in Alaska? Coastal zone management allowed agencies to work directly with impacted communities to solve specific problems and considered overall cumulative effects of the proposed project. Who would like to answer that one first?
I'll be happy to do it. The first part of the question is, could it be improved? I'll answer the coastal management part in a moment, but I personally don't think so, but I think there's always room for a critical look and to improve. And if there is somebody, like, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but if there's something in the specific process for each permit for mining or any other resource development in this state, it's all you have to do is make a suggestion to the legislature. And it's very healthy to do that. In fact, I think you all have a personal responsibility to do that as somebody that lives in Alaska. We all should be suggesting and taking a critical look at the permitting process every single day. So right now I can't come up with anything off the top of my head. I think something like the Mount Poly incident will give us all charge to look and say, what went wrong here? Does that scenario exist in our state? Could it happen? What should we put in place to ensure it doesn't? Is something that we should all do all the time. Coastal management. I do not believe that we have lost anything for the stringent and the quality of our permitting process by coastal management going away. I think at the time, and I was very intimately involved in another ballot measure debate that was another very complex issue, trying to have a discussion in the citizen initiative venue is very difficult, but one of the things that we talked about with everybody, whether you were on the yes or the no side, is permit coordination is a great thing. And the coastal management program provided that, but I think that gave the impetus to our state agencies to look at each other and say, how can we coordinate permits for project applicants to be better? So there's an example of things to suggest to the agencies on what could be better. I don't think that was a suggestion to make it any more stringent. It actually helps any applicant keep their permits in order and make sure that they're getting the same ones at the right time. I have not heard, and I talked to folks about it quite a bit, from anybody that thinks that we are lacking a stringent layer or a check on a project because we don't have the coastal management program anymore.
Anders, you want to
I
respond?
think if you ask some people in communities along the coast and rural Alaska, they may have a different opinion on whether a coastal zone was important to them or not. I think it was an important issue for a lot of people, and I think having that public process is important to people throughout the state. Not all of us are politicos and in the loop and in the know, and having that open and transparent process is a valuable tool. I think we lost something there when we lost that. And in that regard, I believe that this initiative aims to at least rectify that at some small degree to a small level. That is not applying across the entire state, of course, but what we're trying to do is just add some of that public process back that we've lost. And as far as the permitting process is concerned, I think we highlighted a point tonight. I think there should be an economic viability permit. I mean, I think we should look at that, whether a company can maintain operations and keep it going, and have we looked at the economics of it? Where's our standard on that? I mean, it's up to them to make money on it, obviously, for their own company, but we've seen where that has failed in the past. I'm not advocating that tonight. One thing at a time.
The objections to Pebble seem to be tied to its size and the engineering challenges and risks attendant to that size. So I guess there's kind of two questions here. Is there any options for a smaller scale project or projects with less potential impact? Rich or Deantha, do you want to address that?
Give it a try. I don't understand the geology of the project that well, but I think that there is an eastern section of the deposit that's deep, and that section might be mined in a smaller scale by underground methods. But again, I can't make those kind of calls for the company.
I would add on that, I think that we haven't seen a mine plan. I haven't seen a mine plan, and I can't really comment on how it could be done differently.
I think what we've seen in the research I've done on this is that really what we have here is the Costco of mining. It has to be done at a large scale to be economically viable because it's a low-grade ore. It's less than 1% pure, which is 99% waste rock, which requires perpetual storage. To us, that's a big concern, and I think that if you're going to meet this level of all this expensive permitting and all of this really costly infrastructure that you have to put in, you're going to have to see a mine at a certain scale to be able to sustain that. And I think that a smaller project, maybe a wolf in sheep's clothing, just to get entry into a small, and get going. It's much easier to expand a mine than it is to start a large-scale one. Would be a concern of mine.
Deantha, did you want to?
I think the Costco of mining is very clever. I think when you change it would not be possible for a company to come in and submit a mine plan that was drastically different than what they intended to do. When your mine plan does change, you essentially restart that permitting process over again, and you have to submit a new plan of operations and start the process and go back to where you were before. So if a company were to do that, I think it would be an incredibly stupid decision on their part.
Okay, I guess this would be a question for the sponsors. What happens if all the permits are granted and the legislature fails to act?
I would have to consult on that, but I believe that the project would not be allowed to go forward because it would have to meet that standard. It would have to get a legislative approval. If it does not, then it would not have the approval to go forward.
And that's one of the gigantic issues we have and why we encourage you to vote no on it.
The legislature is busy, and to add another huge magnitude of workload is going to slow projects down.
Let's see. I guess this is kind of an open-ended question, but what is Pebble's history with large-scale open-pit mining around the world? I guess that wouldn't be Pebble's history, but I guess that might be too broad of a topic to address at this forum. But I guess succinctly do you have any comments in terms of responding to the history of large-scale open pit mining around the world and how it would relate to this initiative? It's kind of an open up. That's a very vague question.
Yeah, well, I think really the question was, has the company that owns it have worldwide experience in large mines? And Northern Dynasty does not, to my knowledge, but some of the people in it do have worldwide experience. There are some very experienced people in the management of Northern Dynasty. As for them operating a mine, they in fact have never operated a mine, at least to my knowledge. Maybe you know somebody.
No, I don't. I think it's a very common practice for a company like Northern Dynasty. We call them junior companies. Excuse me, to hold claims. To hold claims in an area and look for an investor like they had with Anglo American, a very large mining company that has experience operating large projects and has the capital and the resources in terms of manpower with the knowledge to do it. It's a very common practice in our industry for juniors to find deposits and attract investment, and I don't believe that Northern Dynasty has operated. They've been a junior company that locates deposits.
Yeah, I agree. Northern Dynasty's never developed a mine that I know of. They're completely, 100% is this project now. They've lost their other partners that did have this experience. I used to make an analogy to people, because a lot of people have never been around large-scale mines, but almost everybody in Alaska has spent time in an airplane. And I've always said that, here is a company that has never built, if you will, an airplane and never operated an airplane. But they want to build the world's largest airplane, and they want all of us to get on board. Would you jump on that? And to make us feel better, they brought on a partner who had built airplanes, but a lot of those airplanes had crashed, and not most of them. Yet they still together are going to build this largest airplane, and they want us all to get on board. Would you do that? Because I think that everybody has felt that in Alaska and understands that a little bit, and that just highlights my concern that the large mining companies that did have the experience walked away for some reason to $500 million of investment. They saw something that we should all be looking at and seeing as well.
Deantha?
And I think it's perfectly evident that the large companies that have been in this state and have walked away have left because Alaska is not a smart place to invest right now. And this is just one more reason and one more red flag that will go up. I think that we have litigation, we have ballot measures, we have things like the EPA Bristol Bay Watershed Assessment, and I think companies look at Alaska and see what's happening in our state and what the ability for those that oppose projects to stop projects is, and they simply think it's too risky to invest here. So that's why you're seeing those companies leave.
I think we see plenty of large companies here and operating in Alaska today. Exxon, one of the largest corporations in the world, posted more profits than any company in the history of money at one point. They're operating here. British Petroleum is operating here. ConocoPhillips is operating here. You could keep going on and on and on about large corporations that are here and operating. So,
and if EPA had come in, I'm so sorry.
So if you want to rebut, you can.
If EPA had come in before BP or Exxon applied for any permits, I'm afraid that I don't think we would have a pipeline and we wouldn't have a Prudhoe Bay today if they had shut down a process before a permit was applied for.
That's a lot of speculation on something that happened 30 years ago.
Right, it is.
Isn't relevant to this.
Okay, question for either side. What specific mines have not been reclaimed properly? I guess that's a question more for the sponsors. Examples of specific mines that have not been properly reclaimed.
I don't think that what we're asking for is any kind of concept on the reclamation. I mean, I'm not bringing that issue up. I think what we're talking about is the approval in the first place, not worrying about what happens afterwards. That's not the specifics of this initiative. So I don't know how I would answer that correctly. As far as mines, I think that if you looked at mines like in Butte, Montana, that are still there 50 years after they were operating and are still basically a battery acid pool, and if swans land in them, they die, is a pretty good indication that we have some problems. I think if you look at the Superfund sites across this country, you might find that we have a few problems, and history is a way of repeating itself sometimes.
Deantha or Rich, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I used to run that mine, but it wasn't my fault. That mine started in the mid-1800s and with horrible mining practices, we have to admit, and it was an environmental disaster. I'll have to admit that. But that's ancient practices. We learned from those. We learned from those practices and have cleaned up our act considerably. In fact, there's just no comparison between how a mine operates and is engineered now compared to those days.
Yeah, we just had a huge, I mean, we as in North America, the Mount Poly disaster just happened last week. I couldn't hear. What?
And that's in Canada. We are not Canada.
Northern Dynasty is a Canadian company.
Next,
I should be
next
concerned
question
about that
here.
then.
Next question, why shouldn't the process be politicized? Even if science says the mine would be safe, shouldn't the people of Alaska be able to say through their legislature that they don't want the mine?
I agree.
I don't believe that the process should be politicized. I do believe the people of Alaska have multiple opportunities to say they don't want the mine. They have multiple opportunities to say what they would like to see differently at the mine. They have multiple opportunities to talk directly with the mining company and with the permitting agencies to say what they do and don't like about it. Whether that's through their legislator, I can tell you in the last couple of years where I've been at AMA, I've had legislators at every public meeting. Legislators have the same opportunity. They're a member of the public as well. There is no shortage of opportunity for public comment, but should the legislature have the ability to make scientific decisions when they aren't the scientific-based regulatory agencies is no.
I don't believe that they're making the scientific decisions. I think they're consulting the scientists on all sides and making a judgment call on the overall effect of it, of all of it. We're not asking them to be scientists and make specific judgments on individual permits. We're asking them to review and look at the whole public process and pull before them like they would do in any situation and ask people for testimonies from both sides. And then they're asked to evaluate the overall impact.
So you're essentially in a management review situation. You're asking the legislature to review and say, did the permitting agencies do their job?
They're asked to look at did they do their job, and is there going to be specifically the verbiage of the initiative would be, is there a danger to the fishery by way of approving all of these projects, all these permits in their individual silos? Is there a risk to this fishery? That's the question that we're asking them to answer. And it's going to be up to them to make those decisions. But you're going to have a chance to talk to them about it and have a voice in it.
Okay, this question is directed specifically at Anders. You say that, in your opinion, mining is permitted to be established if the mine does not overlap with the renewable resources in certain areas. What are those areas? And the commenter says that there's always an environmental impact. Is there a place where there is no environmental impact?
I don't believe that I've said there's not environmental impacts anywhere. I mean, of course, every activity, any activity has an impact on anything around it. I think it's a matter of questioning whether the risk is worth the reward for us. And when we're evaluating that reward, I think that if you're looking at an arid climate in the Nevada desert, in a nondescript area that doesn't have a $500 million a year renewable resource pumping into it like Bristol Bay does, that's a separate issue. And we can't just take a blanket approach to all projects across this whole country and across this state. We need to look at them individually. And if there's an additional level of review at a specific region because it has an incredible resource like a wild salmon run that generates a bunch of money for this state's economy, then why shouldn't we ask those questions? I don't see any problem with that. I think if you're proposing a project, the same project in a different part of the state, I don't think you'd have this issue at all. And that's an appropriate way for us to go forward.
Any response? Okay, this question is, are renewable resources included in the permitting process?
Like, do you permit renewable resources?
No, are they addressed, I guess, are they addressed through the permitting process, or are they, how are renewable resources factored into the permitting process?
If you're going to develop a renewable resource, say a wind farm on Fire Island, you're going to have to go through, if not the same permit process that other projects would have to go through. So I'm not sure.
I think the question is, how are renewable resources like fisheries included in a mine permitting process?
Right.
Maybe Rich should address that since he talked.
Obviously, the permitting process would include fisheries, a study of fisheries, the impact on fisheries. If it in fact utilizes wind generation, it would consider the permit process would consider the implications of of that installation and so forth. Hydropower would be another consideration. In fact, if a dam were to be constructed so that hydropower could be generated for the process, and that would be very carefully evaluated as to its effect on fisheries and other resources.
Do we have a couple more questions there? Or? We just have enough for about 2 more questions. Okay. Does the legislature have a say with commercial fishing and its impact on the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve?
Does the legislature have a say in commercial fishing and its impact on the reserve?
Yeah.
The commercial fishing
I think the answer is no.
I think the short answer is no. The long answer is, in a way, they're regulating it through the agencies already. It's kind of a separate issue. I'm not sure I can answer that correctly, or the way they want me to.
I think the commercial fishery is regulated, and the legislature has the authority to make laws, like we've talked about, but I don't think the legislature has the authority over, has the approval over the commercial fishing impact on Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. I hope I understood that question correctly.
Right, I think you're right.
Okay, and this will be our final question. How are the people on permitting boards and agencies selected? Are they appointed, and if so, by whom? Is there the possibility of or potential for political or economic motive in their decision-making? Rich, do you want to start with that?
I'll make a first pass at it. The people are selected based on their technical competence in the agencies. In fact, it's discipline-specific. People with fisheries background go into Fish and Game, and they are part of the review process. So the selection is not just arbitrary. People are chosen and hired based on their qualifications, experience, education, and so forth. And I worked for the state for 6 years. I know a lot of the people that work for state government, and they're really super technically competent. In fact, the dam safety engineer, Charlie Cobb, is one of the most impeccable guys I've ever met. He is a stickler for dam safety, and I gotta hand him a lot of compliments the way he conducts his business.
I think what they're talking about too is we've heard the term like a revolving door between large corporations and permitting processes, and I think that that's a fair concern for people. But I think you have to just basically, again, there's good apples and bad apples, and you can't throw away the whole thing just because you have a few bad apples that are acting in their own self-interest or fail to separate themselves from their jobs and their economic future and their careers. I think that happens in all fashions, from fish to mining to DNR to everything. It's just a part of the problem of having a small populace too.
Okay. I guess with that, that's pretty much, we're close to the time to wrap up questions. And so now we've got time for closing statements. And the way we have it on the agenda is that the supporters speak first so that you two can figure out who goes first, then opponents, then supporters, opponents. Each of you gets 2 minutes to come up with some closing remarks. Anders or Christina, who wants to lead off?
I will. I want to apologize for talking so much this evening. I'm not here as someone very knowledgeable of all the laws and everything that go in the state. I was just here today as a sponsor of this initiative to give you a view of what it's like to live in a rural community that will be affected if a mine like Pebble were to go through. And just to let the public know, a lot of you probably haven't been to Bristol Bay or to my community. Just wanted to give you more of a personal approach to how we feel about issues like this in our region. Thank you.
Go back and
Go
forth.
back to
Does it go back and forth?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think I generally went through my points pretty quickly. Sure, I talked way too fast in my opening statements, but I thought a lot about, you guys had some really great questions, and we covered a lot. We talked about the merits of mining, we talked about the merits of Pebble, we talked about opportunities for public involvement, we talked about the strength of the permitting process and our regulations. And we had some really great discussion here today that I think is really productive, but none of it has anything to do with the legislature doing a final sign-off on Pebble or on any sort of metallic mine in the Bristol Bay Fisheries Reserve. I think that, a check in the box is something that's an additional layer. I think with all the other great topics you brought up today, deserve a really close look and ongoing conversation all the time. But adding just one more checkbox of legislature or one more signature line saying, yeah, we think the agencies that we write the laws for did a good job is not necessary and it's not appropriate. So I really don't think that voting yes on this issue would be a great idea.
Anders?
Yeah, thanks again for everything. I really appreciate it. I think this is our first chance to really publicly debate this issue with anybody too. So, we're working it out as well and getting used to your questions. I do apologize. It's kind of hard to hear with an echo in here. I hope we answered your questions as much as we could. If we didn't, please, come talk to me afterwards, or I've got my card. I'll take any comments you have. That'd be great. And I'll take time to answer it as much as I can. We've obviously want to advocate for a yes vote on this, because what we've seen and what I've seen is with HB 77 trying to go through, coastal zone lost, this ability for the public to really have a say in these large-scale, monstrous projects has been eroded to some degree in this state. And we would like to see that there is an additional review, and most importantly, so that the public can have a meaningful way of participating via their legislature through this democratic process that we all love here in America, as messy and hard as it can be. We think that that's a fair and reasonable and practical way to move forward in this state. Is it a silver bullet that answers all of our problems and cures all the ills of the Pebble Mine issue? No, I don't believe it is. Is it a right step in the right direction? I believe that's true. And I think that it's up to us to take matters into our own hands at sometimes and have an opinion on these things and really weigh in with our elected officials and let them know how we feel. And this is an opportunity to do that. So we wholeheartedly ask you to support ballot measure 4.
Rich?
Yeah, we urge a no vote on this particular proposition because we think, first of all, that it's unconstitutional. It violates the separations of powers doctrine in the state constitution, and it usurps the authority of the permitting agencies within DNR, DEC, Fish and Game, and so forth. So we urge you to consider those implications. I fail to realize or fail to appreciate how the legislature can really bring anything to the crowd or to the process. How are they going to do this? Are they going to go back to the permitting agencies and ask them to do a reanalysis? Are they going to simply tear apart the permits that the studies that the state agencies undertake? If they do, they've got to have people and a huge staff within the legislature to handle it. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. If that isn't done properly within the permitting agencies, incidentally, the Office of Project Management and Permitting is the exemplary, it's world-class agency that people are fashioning their permitting processes on. So I urge your no vote on this. And we're concerned also about the creep that this will have to other venues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much from all the panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause.